The failure of the Democratic Party in the national election is generally conceded to have told us something about the collapse of liberalism as we have known it during the past half-century. There are those who A, insist the pieces can be picked up and reassembled, B, those who feel we should be grown up about the collapse of liberalism and move to the realism of conservative policies, and C, those who believe we should push out to the left. We have no representative here today of the first point of view to argue that Humpty Dumpty could be put together again. Accordingly, we will ventilate the other two alternatives. Our Emmett Tyrrell's new book is called, appropriately, The Liberal Crack-Up. Mr. Tyrrell has been designated by no less an authority on the subject than Tom Wolfe as, quotes, the funniest political essayist to come along in years. The book is funny but also seeks to be lethal, chronicling the disintegration of liberal illusions. Mr. Tyrrell is the editor of the American Spectator, the conservative monthly, published out of Bloomington, Indiana. Bob Tyrrell is a graduate of the University of Indiana, where he also took an MA in 1967. He founded, in 1970, the journal then called The Alternative, now The Spectator. He is the author of Public Nuisances and a syndicated columnist who appears regularly in the Washington Post, a singular achievement. Christopher Hitchens, representing the left, was born in England, went to the Lay School in Cambridge and to Balliol in Oxford. During the 70s, he wrote for the New Statesman. Since 1981, he has served as the Washington columnist for The Nation, as also for the London Spectator. What are your remarks on the implications of these last two defeats? Do you think it was simply reactive against incompetence, or do you think it actually was a rejection of implied political philosophy?
Well, I never thought I'd hear myself saying this, but I'd like to recall to you a very striking phrase, I thought a rather clever phrase, of Norman Podhoretz commenting on the 1980 victory of the Reagan-Bush team, I think in commentary, and saying this is the election that Watergate postponed. Mm-hmm. I thought that was a clever remark. I also thought it was more revealing than it was intended to be. In order to take the line of crack-up that Mr. Tyrrell has offered us in his book and elsewhere, you've got to really believe that it was a good thing that George McGovern lost the 1972 election. Now, I think that's quite a hard position to uphold. I don't think that a liberal or a socialist like myself or any other kind of radical can look back and say it's a jolly good thing that Nixon and Agnew won that time. We, had McGovern won, would have been spared, as well as Mrs. Kirkpatrick at the United Nations and various other bizarre phenomena in the Democratic Party. We'd have been spared the appalling corruption amounting practically to a coup against the Constitution in Washington. I think we would have been spared the particularly abysmal way that the Vietnam and Cambodia wars ended, and we would have been spared the 1974 near war between Greece and Turkey and the destruction and dismemberment of Cyprus.
Up until now, you spared knowledge that we came close to a constitutional coup. Tell me more about it.
Well, in my view, what was at stake at Watergate was not merely, as it were, the right of those at the top or in power to line their pockets or appoint their friends, but it was, under especially Attorney General Mitchell, the use, and this I call high corruption, of police and other federal agencies as if they were private property, the use of the IRS, the FBI and the CIA against political opponents, against pluralism, as it were. I mean, a very serious, as it were, configuration of
You may be a little bit behind in your readings on what happens in America. It was Robert Kennedy, for instance, who got the sex tapes on Martin Luther King. It was FDR who engaged in tapes just as fast as the evolution of technology permitted to do so.
I think you'll find
lots of friends Roosevelt got rich.
My withers,
friends got rich.
My withers, Mr. Buckley, are unwrung. I mean, I never tire of pointing that out in every review of a Kennedy depredation that I do. In fact, I'm on record, I think, this week in the Literary Review about that in the reviewing the Collier Horowitz book on the Kennedys. Of course, everyone has done it. I'm saying that in Watergate, quantity was turning into quality, that there was an attempt to institutionalize the use of agencies of the state as private political police force. If you don't think that's more serious,
well,
that's your problem and not mine.
I would think it more seriously if it was so, but I think that the FBI was used much more widely by the predecessor of Mr. Nixon for such purposes as you describe as by Nixon. I'm really mildly surprised that you think that Mr. Nixon's political appetite to control others ever reached the limits that LBJ's did. A position, by the way, which is reiterated by many friends of LBJ's political program.
Mr. Buckley, if I was to say to you that the government of Poland is a grand tyranny against its people, and you were to say, yes, but so is Czechoslovakia and so is Hungary, what is the point you're making?
Well, the point I'm making,
you mentioned many enemies, you mentioned other enemies of mine in an attempt to deflect from what must be surely an obvious point, which is that the Nixon victory in 1972, the beginning of what we're asked to hail and be pleased about as a liberal crack-up, was a disaster for the United States, for its democracy and for its institutions.
This is
perhaps you haven't said, Mr. Tyrrell, would you rather...
It was certainly a disaster for Cambodia and certainly a disaster for South Vietnam. Unhappily, it was a democratically controlled House and democratically controlled Senate that sealed the coffin lid in that situation. I'm not saying that Caligula is the same as LBJ, and that I have to mention him if I mention Nixon. I was simply isolating your remark that we had evolutionized America into a situation in which we were uniquely menaced, which is anti-historical.
But imagine, by the way, thinking that the presidency of George McGovern would have somehow been a great moment for American public policy and statecraft. I mean, this is the thing about
yes,
this.
I'm not a praiser of politicians, but I don't find. I think it was yesterday in your column in the Post you referred to the McGovern campaign as a gaudy campaign, which it struck me as a most extraordinary use of words for someone so, as it were, painfully honest and unglamorous.
You didn't think the mob surrounding him was gaudy?
No, I certainly did not. I mean, who on earth do you have in mind? Thomas Eagleton?
The whole. Well, it was rather bizarre.
Spectacular. You might say
a
spectacular person. I think gaudy would be pushing it a little. I just think people should be.
You thought those people were kind of Brooks Brothers?
Should accept the logical and probable consequences of what they say. What you say is it was a good thing. What you must believe is it was a good thing that Nixon and Agnew won that election.
Oh, God,
I say
yes.
that is the root problem with.
As a matter of fact, I tend to agree more with you, but for reasons that will leave you unsmiling. Namely that I would much rather have had McGovern be there when we let down our allies in Southeast Asia than to have had Nixon do it. Nixon's preoccupation with Watergate did two things. Number one, it preoccupied him. Number two, it weakened executive power so that Congress was able to do that which it most probably could not have done under other circumstances. As I say, I would rather McGovern had presided over those 4 years than Nixon.
No, actually, you unfortunately, you fail of your effect. Your answer does make me smile, because you haven't got the point that Watergate was the nemesis of a system of lying and deceit that originated in the need to lie about the war in Indochina, Vietnam, Cambodia. That was what necessitated the making of lying and deceit and the destabilization of opponents
I'd have thought it was original
into an institutional rather than a random political.
In the first place, the principal lie, if we got to taxonomize these things, dates back to Gulf of Tonkin, which had nothing to do with the public administration. Which was accepted by the Senate with only 2 dissenting votes, and which was proclaimed by Lyndon Johnson. So that if...
Why do you feel this somehow negates what I say, the fact that it was a democratic...
Well, I don't doubt, Mr. Hitchens, that you don't like the American system. You're perfectly free to despise it. I don't like you to say, simply conveniently, that which you don't like is exclusively associated with Republican presidents, that's all.
I made no such... allegation. We're discussing.
You're talking about the
liberalism.
unique dangers of the Watergate era.
We're discussing liberalism. I made the citation of George McGovern. It seems to me that by saying of George McGovern, he isn't Lyndon Johnson, one sticking to the truth, and to say Lyndon Johnson is a liberal is stretching it even further than Mr. Tyrrell does in his book.
He's much worse than Lyndon Johnson. Anybody who would voted for Henry Wallace and refuses to apologize for it 25 years later is saying, in effect, that he was perfectly comfortable with Stalinist policies and with conciliation towards Stalinism in Europe. And George McGovern, who's a friend of mine, simply declines to apologize for the equivalent of voting for Hitler in 1932.
Well, there may be loyalty tests you can set that he can't pass, but I still think that to mention him and Lyndon Johnson in the same breath, say they're both Democrats, which means that they're almost liberals, and therefore that proves it, is worse than the ahistorical that you accuse me of.
Well,
but then, I thought we were sticking to liberalism.
They
and
both
Mr.
call
Tyrrell
how can we
themselves liberals. They
How
both
can we
call
stick to
themselves liberals.
liberalism how can we even discuss liberalism with you if you won't accept that George McGovern was a liberal? I mean, that
sorry,
LBJ was a liberal.
I'm claiming that...
I mean, we have a real problem here. We should have a Bircher here, too, because you two, with your extreme views of politics in this country, could get along perfectly.
No, but I think it's helpful that you claim Johnson's a liberal, because I think it shows what the essential category mistake of your book is, that a liberal is someone who you call a liberal, and the elasticity of your definition allows you to have a fair old romp.
Yeah.
But I mean, if you
Well,
can find...
Well, in one of his books, John Dewey, some patient scholar discovered, used the word liberal to mean 23 different things. And it's true about the elasticity of the word. After all, there was all that long ago that Woodrow Wilson said the history of liberalism is the history of man's efforts to restrain the growth of government. So we acknowledge it. But as liberal is used, let's say an ADA liberal is something both of them would have designated themselves as being. How's that?
Well, Johnson and the ADA were not pals.
Oh, for God's sake. Johnson...
No. The ADA opposed Johnson back when he was thought of as being a Southern regenerate.
Mm-hmm.
They were wildly enthusiastic about him ever since. The president of the ADA, John Kenneth Galbraith, as recently as 2 weeks ago, said that LBJ was a great saint of liberalism, unfortunately tainted by the commitment to the Vietnamese War.
Well, that's
You know what
like
a
saying,
beautiful
as
thing you
Hemingway
got?
said about your aunt, if she had cojones, would be your uncle. I mean,